Welcome, folks, to another lesson in the prophecy series. Today, we're going to focus on, again, our look at introductory material to our entire series concerning biblical prophecy. In particular, we're looking at lesson 4 today, which is also our final lesson in our material before we begin our study into the certain books that we have in our scriptures. We're going to focus, like we did in our last lesson, concerning the different viewpoints that are out there concerning the second coming that are very prevalent in our churches and around us today in Christendom. And we're going to especially focus on the issue of the tribulation, the rapture, and the second coming. So what I want to do is I want to focus on what are the different viewpoints that are out there concerning the tribulation and the rapture. Now, if you remember in our last lesson, I told you that there were many different perspectives concerning the millennium. And I mentioned there was premillennialism, postmillennialism, amillennialism. With regards to the issue of the tribulation and the rapture, you're going to see that this is primarily held by those who are premillennial. And if you remember, a couple of lessons ago, we gave you the definition of the tribulation concerning it being a period of time in which God's wrath is poured onto this world. So let's begin. So we're going to look, first of all, at what is known as the pre-tribulational view. So again, these views have to do with the issue of the rapture. That is where Jesus comes and removes believers to meet him in the air. It's mentioned in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Now, the pre-tribulational view, according to the pre-tribulational view, there will be a 7-year period when God's wrath is poured out on the world. So if you think about the terrible things that are going on in our world right now, the earthquakes, the wars, the famines, the diseases that we're facing, people dying through all of that, that is nothing compared to what will happen in this final 7-year period. And those who hold to a pre-tribulational view believe that there is this 7-year period in which God's judgment concerning the sins of the world, concerning their actions towards Israel, will be poured out on the world. Now, according to the pre-tribulational view, the church will be removed or raptured before the tribulation begins. So typically, and this has been a standard viewpoint in North American Christianity for a while, is that the church will be raptured. Jesus will come, meet them in the air, and he will rapture them out, and then this 7-year period will begin. They will be spared from that judgment. So during the tribulation, Israel will once again be the focus of God's program. Right now, according to those who hold to a pre-tribulational viewpoint, the focus of God's program is the church. But that will end, and the focus will return back to Israel during this 7-year period. Now, this will occur when the fullness of the Gentiles has come. And we find that in Romans chapter 11, verse 25. And here is what Paul writes: "Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come." Now, let me just stop and help you to understand what is Paul saying here. He wants us not to be wise in our own thinking, like we know everything, we know what's going on. He wants you to be aware that there is a plan for Israel, but right now Israel is under a partial hardening. Their hearts are hardened. They can't see the Messiah. Now, how long will that take place? Well, he's saying until the fullness of the Gentiles. Now, what does that mean, George? Well, that word fullness can also be translated full number of Gentiles. What we can gather from that is that there will come a time when the number of Gentiles who are to be saved will be reached, and God will remove the church, and the attention and the plan of God will be back focused on Israel during that 7-year period. Now, there is a second viewpoint. It's called the mid-tribulation view. Now, just as its name kind of refers to, here's what the basic things you need to understand about this viewpoint. The church will be removed in the middle of the tribulation. Now, this is based upon the fact that those who hold to the mid-tribulation view will say in the passage concerning the rapture that we see in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, that it mentions the last trumpet, when the last trumpet happens. They then go over to the book of Revelation, and the second series of judgments that take place during the tribulation period are known as the trumpet judgments. And so they say when that final trumpet, that seventh trumpet is sounded, that's when the rapture will take place, and that is in the middle of the tribulation. So basically, with this viewpoint, the church will endure the events of the first half of the tribulation. So when this 7-year tribulation begins, the church will endure the tribulation. Now, that brings us to our third viewpoint concerning the rapture. Again, a premillennial view. I need you to understand what's happening here. It's called the post-tribulational view. So this means the rapture will occur after the tribulation. Here's what it says. The church will continue on earth until the second coming of Jesus Christ. So the earth will continue through the tribulation until the second coming. The church will endure all of the judgments in the tribulation. So when you look at the book of Revelation and you see the seal judgments and you see the trumpet judgments, and then finally you see the bowl judgments, all of those things that are described there that are poured out on the earth, all the terrible things that will happen, according to this viewpoint, the church will have to endure all of these judgments in the tribulation. Why is that? Because this view, the post-tribulational view, does not necessarily see a distinction between the church and Israel. So remember, I told you with some of our other viewpoints, amillennialism, postmillennialism, the reality is they, even historic premillennialism, they view the church as the replacement. So they don't see a distinction between Israel and what it says about Israel in Revelation and the church. Now, there is a fourth view that has emerged in, say, 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. It's called the pre-wrath rapture view. Now, the pre-wrath view sees the rapture as a combination of the first three views. So with this view, they take certain points from the other views, the pre-tribulational, the mid-tribulational, and the post-tribulational view, and they blend them into this viewpoint concerning the pre-wrath view. Now, this view believes that all believers will be exempt from the wrath of God. Now, what we see here is, with this viewpoint, they don't view the entire 7-year period as being when God's wrath is poured out. It is poured out, but it's poured out in the last portion of the 7-year period. So they don't believe that believers will go through that. They'll be exempt from when God pours out his wrath. This view does not believe that all believers will be exempt from the 7-year period. So when this 7-year period of tribulation begins, they believe at first all believers will go through it. Now, part of that is if you remember the plagues that were poured out on Egypt, Israel had to endure the first 2 plagues. They had to endure. It's after the first 2 plagues that Israel then was exempted from the remaining 8 plagues. So you see, this is the same type of thing. So the church has to endure. This view sees a distinction between the wrath of Satan, which is poured out in the sense of this viewpoint at the beginning of the tribulation, and the wrath of God, which will be poured out in the end in judgment. This view sees the day of the Lord coming at the end of the tribulation. So whereas the premill-tribulational viewpoint would say the day of the Lord is the whole 7-year period, they would say it's at the end of the tribulation. So believers will experience the great tribulation, but will be raptured out before God's wrath is poured out. And that in particular is speaking about those bowl judgments that we see in the book of Revelation. Now, there are some other viewpoints that we need to discuss if we're going to talk about the rapture, especially if we're from a premillennial viewpoint. And one of them is one that has been around for years. It's called the partial rapture view. Partial rapture view. Now, what does that mean? Well, this view is not concerned with the timing of the rapture. Now, when you talk about the pre-trib or the mid-trib or post-trib or the pre-wrath view of the trib, they are all focused on when the timing of the rapture will take place and what the church has to endure or not endure. This viewpoint is not concerned with the timing of the rapture at all. What is it focused on? This view concerns the issue of who will be raptured. Now you're saying to yourself, now George, I thought that it's the church, it's all believers will be raptured and go to be with the Lord. Yes, but with the partial rapture, it's saying that those who are worthy are raptured. And so they would look at the Gospels where Jesus says there'll be 2 in a field, one will be taken, one will be left. And they view that as being a discussion concerning the rapture and how one will be taken, one will not. And here's why. Only those who are watching and waiting will be raptured. So if you're not right with God, if you are in sin, if you're a believer, according to this viewpoint, and you are not where you should be in your relationship with the Lord, when the rapture takes place, you'll be left behind. But those who know the Lord and are watching for Him will be raptured. Now, there is one final viewpoint that we need to point out concerning the rapture. And it is called, if you're ready for this, the no rapture view. The no rapture view. And as the title of this view expresses, here's what it is. This view does not see the rapture as a distinct event from the second coming. So when you look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, they would say that this is a description of what happens at the second coming, when Jesus Christ comes back to set up His kingdom. And so with this viewpoint, they would say that the rapture is not distinct. In fact, passages concerning the rapture in other parts of the Scripture are speaking of the second coming. That's what this viewpoint would hold. Now, here is the reality as we're going to end our introductory material. We've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about different viewpoints concerning the millennium, different viewpoints concerning the second coming, the reality of the rapture, when it takes place, if it does take place or not, what people hold to, and all of that. And so I want to kind of give you some final thoughts before we begin to look at the books of the Scripture in our prophecy series. I want you to recognize a flexibility in interpretation. Now, why am I bringing that up? Well, because we have certain tendencies when we come to a conclusion about what we believe about the second coming. So here's the first one. Don't be dogmatic about your interpretations. Don't be dogmatic about your interpretations. Now, why would you say that, George? Well, because here's what happens. If you and I begin to study the Scripture and we become convinced that we understand the fulfillment of certain prophecies and certain passages of Scripture, we can become dogmatic. We can think that we're right and that everyone else is wrong. Now, the problem is I've watched over the last 40 years of my being a believer in Jesus Christ, folks who have been dogmatic about their seeing the fulfillment of Scripture before them and Jesus Christ coming back, and being dogmatic about it and judging others who don't see what they see, and then only to find out that their interpretation was wrong. And we've seen that happen, haven't we? So here's the thing. Don't be dogmatic. You can have a viewpoint, but don't be dogmatic. Be open to the reality that you might be wrong and that interpretations are different. So here's the thing you and I need to recognize. Here's the second thing. Recognize that the church has struggled to understand these books for centuries. Do you realize since these books were given, from the book of Daniel or the book of Zechariah, from the Gospels and what Jesus says about the second coming, or the references to the coming of the Lord in the epistles, and then ultimately with the book of Revelation, from that time on, I'm going to tell you that the church has struggled and continues to struggle with understanding these books. And so therefore, the things that we come up with that we think are sure, and these are the interpretations of what should happen, sometimes they are proven to be true. Sometimes, and many times, they're not proven to be true. So recognize, here's the third thing, that false teaching and cults have arisen from dogmatic interpretations. So I think about a group in North America around the beginning of the 1800s. They're waiting on a hill in the northeast of the United States for Jesus to come back. There's a lightning storm. They're up there dressed in white because they were told they were studying the return of Christ. And then what happens? Jesus didn't come back. There was just a lightning storm. But what they had to do is they had to somehow explain the reality that Jesus didn't come back. And so they began to espouse a teaching that the Lord returned spiritually, not bodily. That is a false teaching. Where did that false teaching come from? From dogmatic interpretations where they couldn't recognize that they were wrong. And so these are the three things that I want you to think about. First of all, don't be dogmatic about your interpretations. Recognize that the church has struggled with these books for centuries. And then also realize that if you hold to dogmatic teaching, it can lead you into false teaching or even into cults. So this is the end of our introductory material. Now, as I mentioned to you in the very first lesson, what we want to do is we want to study, we want to have an understanding of what the Scripture teaches concerning biblical prophecy. We're not wanting to look at this in some sensational way. We're wanting to look and see what the Scripture says. So here's what we're going to do. In our next lesson in the prophecy series, we're going to begin our study in the book of Daniel. Now, we're not just going to focus on the prophecy sections of Daniel. We're going to look at the whole book so that when we get to the prophecy sections, we kind of understand what is happening. When we get done with Daniel, we'll go to Zechariah. When we finish Zechariah, we'll go to the Gospels and reflect on the teaching from the Gospels that Jesus gave concerning his coming. We're going to move into the epistles from Paul and Peter and others concerning the return of Christ. And then finally, we're going to go through the book of Revelation. So I'm hoping that with this introductory material, you are ready to progress on, because we're going to begin next week. And so I hope you're back with me next week in the prophecy series as we look at the book of Daniel.